I always imagined my granddaughter's wedding would be a day wrapped in warmth, an afternoon where laughter floated through the air, and love stitched together every conversation. Instead, it was the moment I realized I had become invisible. In my own family, save for the number attached to my bank account. That realization didn't come with a confrontation or a cruel comment hurled across the table, it came delicately printed in golden cursive on a name tag. The old lady who will pay for everything, my gal. I stood at the entrance of the Westbrook Hotel's grand ballroom, staring at the small rectangle handed to me by a smiling young woman who had no idea she'd just delivered the most humiliating message I'd received in my 65 years. My breath caught in my throat. Surely, it was a printing mistake. I must have picked up the wrong card. I politely asked her to double-check. She flipped through the rest, nothing else bore my name. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Edwards," she said. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe someone had made a careless error. But a sliver of dread twisted in my gut. Because deep down, I already knew, this wasn't an accident. This was intentional. I walked through the gleaming doors with that ridiculous tag pinned to my pale blue dress. The same dress Robert used to say made my eyes glow. My late husband had adored that color. I wore it today to feel close to him, to carry a piece of him as I watched our granddaughter walk down the aisle. But the joy I had felt earlier, at the church when Jennifer looked radiant in white and Richard had beamed as he walked her down the aisle, that joy had withered the second I was reduced to a punchline. I tried to blend into the reception crowd, hoping no one would look too closely at my name tag, praying they'd simply assume it was a quirky joke or not see it at all. But people did see. I caught the whispers. Two women giggling behind their hands. One man nudging his wife. Pamela said they thought it was hilarious, someone whispered. Apparently, she's their personal ATM. My spine stiffened. I turned, heart hammering, only to find their backs already turned. I hadn't imagined it. They were laughing at me. And my daughter-in-law, the woman who married my son, had orchestrated it. I barely had time to retreat before Richard spotted me. "Mom, come meet the Andersons," he called out across the ballroom, waving me toward a group of well-dressed guests sipping wine. "Dad used to golf with Bill." My feet moved, though my heart begged me to leave. Bill Anderson smiled politely. His wife glanced at my tag. Something in her expression tightened. Richard laughed casually. "This is my mother, our family's walking bank account." I felt the breath leave my lungs. Was I supposed to smile? Laugh along? Pretend I hadn't just been publicly reduced to a financial plan with a face? I forced out a weak, "Alice Edwards, Robert's widow." Bill's expression softened. "Your husband spoke highly of you. He always said you were the backbone of the family." But I wasn't sure that was true anymore. The backbone had been twisted, used, and mocked. When the Andersons moved on, I pulled Richard aside. "Why did you let them print this?" I asked, holding up the tag. "Oh, come on, Mom," he chuckled. "It's just a bit of fun. Everyone knows you're the generous one. You've paid for everything. Why not celebrate that?" "Celebrate? Being reduced to a joke? It's humiliating," I whispered. "Oh, lighten up," he said, rolling his eyes. "It's a party." Pamela appeared at his side, glowing in her designer gown. "There you are, Alice. Has Richard been showing you off?" she asked, placing her hand on my shoulder like I was a trophy on a shelf. "Everyone's so impressed by what you've done for the wedding." Her tone dripped with sugar. I nodded, murmured an excuse, and escaped to the restroom. There, in the quiet fluorescent light, I stared at myself in the mirror. My hands trembled as I dabbed the corners of my eyes. The name tag still clung to my dress like a parasite. That was when I heard the voice from outside the restroom door. "Mrs. Edwards? Alice?" It was Martin Reynolds, my late husband's attorney. He had handled Robert's estate and been a trusted friend for decades. I stepped out, still shaky. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, his eyes flicking to the offending label. I heard some of the things being said. "It's not right. Robert would be furious." He reached into his suit jacket. "I didn't want to do this here, but I think you should know. Robert added something to his will before he passed. A codicil. He made me promise not to share it unless necessary." My heart stopped. Martin handed me a sealed envelope. I broke the seal with shaking hands. The language was legal, complex, but the meaning struck like thunder. Any family member who publicly humiliated me would be removed from Robert's will. Their inheritance would be gone. The clause was ironclad, and Martin's tone confirmed it. He didn't want to control anyone. He simply hoped they'd love you for you, not your resources. I looked toward the ballroom, the glittering chandeliers, the echoing laughter. None of them knew they had just gambled with millions. "What do you want to do?" Martin asked. I folded the document carefully and returned it to him. "Nothing," I said. "Not yet." Because I needed to know just how far they would go. The name tag was only the beginning. The morning after Jennifer's wedding, I sat in my kitchen, wrapped in my robe, staring at the discarded name tag that had shattered everything. The script was elegant, the words anything but. I laid it on the table like evidence at a crime scene. The phrase, "the old lady who will pay for everything," danced mockingly in gold ink. I ran my fingers over the letters, the corners of my eyes stinging. If Robert had seen it, his fury would have scorched through the reception like wildfire. My husband was calm, patient, but when it came to protecting me, he never wavered. I whispered into the silence, "Did we raise them wrong? Or did we just choose not to see who they really were?" I moved into the living room, drawn to the family portrait mounted above the fireplace. 5 years ago, Robert and I had gathered everyone for our 40th anniversary. In the photo, he sat proudly in the center, still full of life despite the illness quietly creeping through his bones. I stood beside him with a hand on his shoulder. Our son Richard, his wife Pamela, and our grandchildren Jennifer and Michael framed us perfectly. A tableau of unity. I searched the faces, hunting for cracks in the illusion. Maybe the erosion had always been there, just hidden beneath practiced smiles and well-timed compliments. I made tea, the kettle hissing like an old warning I'd ignored for too long. That photograph, so full of warmth, now seemed like a fossil, preserving something that had already turned to stone. The first fissure, I realized, came 6 months after Robert's funeral. Richard and Pamela had invited me to dinner. A rare gesture. They'd poured wine, asked thoughtful questions, reminisced about Robert with tears and tenderness. And then, over creme brulee, came the real reason. "Mom," Richard had said, topping off my glass. "Pamela and I are thinking of updating the kitchen. Nothing extravagant, just new appliances, some counters." Pamela had nodded, face full of sweet concern. "With tuition and everything else, we're stretched thin. We thought maybe, since Dad left you comfortable," the word floated between us like a balloon filled with guilt. I had nodded, too trusting, too eager to stay close. That night, I wrote a check for $30,000. That was the beginning. What started as a kitchen remodel became a full-blown renovation, walls knocked down, imported tiles, a backyard pergola. Then came tuition help. Then cars for the kids. Then travel expenses for family vacations that I funded but was barely invited to. I opened the hallway closet and pulled out a dusty box of bank statements. I sat cross-legged on the floor like a schoolgirl doing homework, except this assignment was decades overdue. Page after page, I added numbers, scanned check copies, tallied transfers. $250,000. That's how much I had given them over 3 years. My pen trembled on the last figure. $250,000 evaporated under the disguise of family need. The phone rang, slicing through the silence. I answered without thinking. It was Pamela. "Alice. There you are. I've been calling. Your cell. Is everything all right?" I hadn't realized I'd left it in my clutch from last night. "I'm fine," I said. "Just resting." "Well, Richard and I just wanted to say thank you again. The wedding was perfect. Jennifer's over the moon. They're so grateful." I remembered the $45,000 check I'd written for the venue and catering. I hadn't been asked, just expected to foot the bill because it would mean so much to Jennifer. "I'm glad," I said quietly. Pamela's tone shifted to that syrupy blend of flattery and manipulation she reserved for big requests. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. Mark's parents were supposed to cover the honeymoon, but they've hit some financial trouble. Jennifer's devastated. They had their hearts set on 2 weeks in Bali." I closed my eyes, bracing myself. "We were wondering, could you step in? We'll help, of course. But with everything we already contributed. As if they hadn't handed me a spreadsheet and watched while I signed checks. "I'll think about it," I said. Surprising both of us. Pamela paused. "They need to book soon, to get the best rates." "I understand. I'll let you know tomorrow." I hung up and returned to my papers. Robert had warned me once, years ago, that Richard's relationship with money bordered on obsession. "He thinks wealth solves everything," he had said. "But money without values just breeds dependency." I hadn't wanted to see it then. I wanted to believe my son was good, generous, capable. I wanted peace more than I wanted truth. A knock at the door startled me. I peeked through the peephole. "Michael." My grandson stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight. Nervously. I scrambled to hide the papers, tucking them back into the closet before opening the door. "Grandma," he said softly, pulling me into a hug. He was tall like his grandfather, with kind eyes that always saw more than they let on. "I've been texting. Are you all right?" "Just tired," I said, ushering him inside. "Come in. I'll make fresh tea." In the kitchen, I moved slowly, still emotionally raw from the numbers I had unearthed. Michael sat at the table, folding his hands. I wanted to apologize. For yesterday. The name tag. The jokes. The way people talked about you. It wasn't right. I swallowed hard. You noticed? Everyone did. I should have said something. I reached over and touched his hand. It's not your burden. But it is my responsibility to recognize what's happening. He looked at me, solemn and sincere. Dad and Mom, they've changed. Or maybe they've always been this way. And I just didn't want to admit it. Lately, all they talk about is your money. How it could be used. What's fair? I steadied myself against the edge of the counter. What do you mean? Michael hesitated. Last week, I overheard them talking about your house. Dad said it's too big for one person. He said they should help you downsize. The kettle began to whistle. I poured the water into the pot, letting the steam rise between us. Suddenly, Martin's words and Robert's codicil felt like armor. The insult wasn't isolated. It was a pattern, decisions made about me without me. Plans built on the assumption that I'd fund them all indefinitely. Michael, I said, sitting down again. I think I've been blind for far too long. But not anymore. He looked worried. Are you okay? Better than I've been in years, I answered. And for the first time since Robert died, I meant it. The fog was lifting. Clarity had arrived. And I was ready to see what they would try next. 3 days after Jennifer's wedding, an invitation arrived that would seal the direction of everything that followed. Richard and Pamela were hosting a post-wedding brunch at the Oak Ridge Country Club, a polished affair meant to reinforce their image of elegance and generosity. I wasn't eager to attend. My body still carried the weight of that name tag, and my soul was bruised from everything I'd overheard. But part of me needed to go, not out of obligation, but curiosity. I had to know whether that incident at the wedding had been a careless slip, or part of something more calculated. I dressed carefully that morning. The cream pantsuit I chose had always made Robert say I looked like royalty. He would call me my queen in that soft, admiring voice of his, even after 4 decades together. As I applied my lipstick with steady hands, I whispered to my reflection, let's see what they show us today. The country club's private dining room was buzzing with familiar voices and polished laughter when I arrived. Jennifer and Mark were already there, seated near a window flooded with late morning sunlight. Michael greeted me with a warm smile. But I immediately noticed my seat had been placed next to Mark's parents, pleasant strangers at best, while Jennifer sat at a distant corner, surrounded by friends and younger relatives. I took my seat quietly, already sensing the unspoken message: proximity didn't belong to me. When Pamela stood and clinked her glass for attention, I sipped my coffee with slow deliberation, trying to steel myself for whatever performance was coming. We just want to thank everyone for making Jennifer and Mark's wedding so magical, she began, voice dripping with artificial sincerity. And of course, none of it would have been possible without Grandma Alice, our family's fairy godmother. All heads turned toward me. I nodded graciously, unwilling to cause a scene. And we have some exciting news, she continued, grinning wider. Grandma will also be sending the happy couple on their dream honeymoon, to Bali. Applause broke out. I froze. My coffee cup hovered midair, unmoving. A hush settled quickly when I didn't respond. I cleared my throat. This is the first I'm hearing of that, I said, voice calm but unmistakably firm. Jennifer looked bewildered. Mark blinked, unsure if it was a joke. We discussed it yesterday, Pamela said, her smile faltering. You said you'd think about it. Yes, and I'm still thinking. Richard leaned in close, voice pitched for the table to hear. Mom, don't embarrass us. We already told them to book the flights. And there it was again, that entitlement dressed in a tuxedo. That assumption that because I always gave, I always would. I set my cup down. I don't recall agreeing to fund a honeymoon to Bali, I said, louder this time. In fact, I believe Mark's parents initially offered to handle those expenses. Mark's father shifted uncomfortably. There were setbacks, he muttered. Understandable, I replied kindly. But publicly offering someone else's money is never appropriate. Don't you agree? The air grew thick with discomfort. Pamela's mouth tightened. Maybe Jennifer and Mark could consider something more within their own means. Pamela's facade cracked. Within their means? And what about yours? Her voice rose. Everyone knows you've been sitting on a fortune since Robert passed. Why act like it's a crime to share some of it? It wasn't just her tone, it was the audacity, the implication that my wealth was no longer mine but communal property. My finances, I said coolly, are not a group project. Nor are my decisions anyone else's concern. Richard's jaw clenched. He grabbed my arm under the table, not gently. Mom, enough. His whisper was sharp. You're ruining everything. I shook off his grip. No, Richard. You've ruined it, by assuming my generosity is infinite and owed. I stood. My chair scraped back against the polished floor. Jennifer, Mark, I said, softening my voice. I wish you joy. I'll be happy to support a modest honeymoon if you speak with me privately. But this spectacle ends now. Michael immediately rose. I'll walk you out, Grandma. His gesture wasn't dramatic. It was respectful. Protective. In the lobby, I let my hand shake as I searched my purse for my keys. You all right to drive? He asked. I nodded. Just a bit rattled. But yes. He smiled, gently. What you did back there, it was brave. I looked at him closely, and in his steady gaze, I saw a glimmer of Robert. That quiet strength, that ability to remain centered while everything around him spun. Dinner tonight? I asked suddenly. Just us? He didn't hesitate. I'd love that. That evening, over a simple roast chicken and warm apple pie, I told Michael everything, how the small asks had turned into large expectations, how the joy of giving had become a tether around my neck. He listened without judgment. After Grandpa died, he said, they stopped seeing you as a person. Just a purse with legs. He didn't sugarcoat it. And they're not going to stop. Last week, I overheard another conversation about moving you into a retirement complex. Something about how it would free up capital for the next phase of family planning. I blinked, stunned. My home, the place where Robert and I built a life, was now a financial opportunity in their eyes. A chess piece. Michael reached across the table. You don't deserve that. Not after everything. I squeezed his hand. Michael, there's something I need to show you. But not yet. Because while a codicil might protect an estate, it couldn't heal the wounds caused by those you raised. That had to be done another way. Tomorrow, I would begin to reclaim my life, not through confrontation, but through clarity. My silence had allowed the rot to spread. But now, I would use that same silence as a shield. No threats. No warnings. Just change. Quiet, unwavering change. The morning after the brunch, sunlight spilled across my kitchen floor like everything was normal, but nothing was. I stood barefoot at the counter, fingers wrapped around a warm mug, eyes locked on the backyard garden that Robert and I had once tended with quiet joy. Now, weeds curled at the edges of the beds. Roses wilted from neglect. It was as if even the earth outside had been waiting for me to remember who I was. I sat down at the table, the same spot where I had once mapped out school schedules, family trips, grocery lists. Now the surface was bare except for my checkbook and a slim manila folder containing documents Martin had given me after the wedding. I opened it again, rereading the codicil. Each line felt sharper than the last. It didn't just strip away entitlement, it cut through years of manipulation with one deliberate clause. And yet, I hadn't acted. Not because I was uncertain of the truth, but because I needed to see what they would do next. What they had already planned. When the doorbell rang that afternoon, I knew who it was before I looked through the window. Richard's car sat in the driveway, glinting arrogantly under the sun. I opened the door slowly, Michael at my side. We need to talk, Richard barked, stepping past me into the hall. His expression was tight with fury, his voice louder than necessary. What was that show you pulled at brunch? He stopped abruptly when he saw Michael. And why is he here? Michael crossed his arms. Having dinner with Grandma. You should try it sometime, without an agenda. The dig hit its mark. Richard's lip curled. Stay out of this. But I cut in. No. He stays. If we're going to have this conversation, we're not doing it in whispers anymore. Richard blinked, momentarily thrown. He'd always relied on catching me off guard, on my desire to avoid drama. But this time, I was steady. I walked into the living room and sat down in Robert's old armchair, grounding myself in the memory of the man who had always believed in my strength, even when I forgot it. Mom, this attitude isn't like you, Richard said, pacing the rug like a trapped animal. First, you humiliate us in front of our friends. Then I find out you've been feeding Michael stories that paint us as villains. Michael didn't flinch. No one's feeding me anything. I'm just paying attention. Richard turned to me, face softening into the manipulative expression I knew too well. You're misinterpreting everything. Pamela and I are just trying to look out for your well-being. You're not getting younger, and there's a lot of financial responsibility on your shoulders. I smiled tightly. I'm 65, not senile. And I've been managing my finances just fine without a guardian. Richard sighed, exasperated. Dad left you more than enough. We just think it's time to start planning ahead, downsizing, consolidating, helping the family where it counts. Let me be clear, I said. Robert left me what he intended. Not a penny more, not a cent less. And what I choose to do with it is no one's business but mine. The real Richard emerged then. The mask slipped. So that's it? Because of a stupid name tag, you're cutting us out? No, I replied coolly. I'm drawing a line. One that should have been drawn years ago. He scoffed. You'd fund Michael's bookstore fantasy, but not help your own son buy a second home? Michael's voice was quiet but firm. It's not a fantasy. I have a business plan, investors, and market research. Grandma believes in it. Richard's eyes narrowed. Of course she does. You've got her wrapped around your finger now, don't you? That's enough, I snapped. You've treated me like a wallet with a pulse for years. You've made decisions behind my back, announced plans that weren't yours to make, and belittled me in public. That ends now. He stepped back, stunned by the force of my words. Then, trying a new tactic, he glanced at Michael. Leave us. I need a moment with my mother. Michael stayed rooted to the spot. I'm family too. Richard looked at him like he was a stranger. You've always been the quiet one. Never had much ambition. And now you're inserting yourself into decisions that don't concern you. Michael didn't budge. Protecting Grandma does concern me. Richard's jaw twitched. Fine. But this isn't over. He stormed out, the front door slamming behind him like a punctuation mark. I let out a slow breath, feeling the tension unspool from my shoulders. You all right? Michael asked gently. I nodded. I should have done this a long time ago. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through every room in my house, touching photographs, running my fingers over furniture Robert built, remembering quiet Sunday mornings and the smell of fresh coffee. They wanted this place. They had plans for it. I imagined the real estate listing already written in their heads, charming, spacious, ready for development. They saw this house as property. I saw it as proof that love once lived here. The next morning, I called Martin. I want to understand the entire will. Not just the codicil, but all of it. He suggested I come in that afternoon. I dressed carefully again, nothing flashy, just a structured blazer, soft lavender blouse, and Robert's favorite silver earrings. Martin's office was warm, filled with the scent of leather-bound ledgers and polished wood. He handed me the full file and began explaining. Robert had built more than I realized, companies, investments, rental properties. All tucked away under LLCs and trust accounts. He had never boasted, never made our wealth a performance. He always said you married him when he had nothing but ambition and a rusty Chevy, Martin said with a wistful smile. He didn't want wealth to change either of you. I smiled, hearing Robert's voice in that memory. Then Martin leaned forward. The codicil is ironclad. But if you'd like to make additions or changes to your own will, reallocate assets, you absolutely can. I nodded. That's exactly what I intend to do. When I walked out of his office, the air felt different, lighter, purposeful. I didn't need revenge. I needed peace. I needed a life where I chose joy, not obligation. Where giving was a gift, not a tax. First, I called an old friend I hadn't seen since the funeral. We made plans for lunch. Then I stopped by the community center and picked up a brochure for painting classes. Robert had always encouraged me to explore that side of myself. Maybe it was time. At home, I opened my laptop and began researching small business grants. Michael had mentioned the bookstore in passing once, hesitant, unsure. I saw it differently now. I saw a legacy born not of greed, but of passion. That night, when the phone rang and I saw Pamela's name flash on the screen, I didn't answer. Her message, when I listened to it later, was everything I expected: syrupy concern, veiled pressure, and a polite demand for another dinner to clear the air. I deleted it. Instead, I wrote a modest check and placed it in a card addressed to Jennifer and Mark. Enough for a comfortable honeymoon in Cape Cod, beautiful, peaceful, and well within their means. No Bali. No spectacle. I sealed the envelope with a small note: enjoy your time together. Happiness isn't bought, it's built. Then I went to bed. For the first time in years, I slept without clenching my jaw. The days that followed unfolded not in grand gestures, but in subtle revolutions. I didn't announce anything. I didn't lecture or retaliate. I simply began to live, on my terms. At the community center, I enrolled in 2 painting classes and a short course on digital art. I bought a fresh set of brushes, soft pastels, and linen canvases. For years, I had poured myself into other people's needs. Now, I was coloring outside the lines they had drawn for me. My mornings filled with texture and color, while my afternoons grew quiet, reflective. Michael visited frequently, each time with an update on his bookstore dream. He brought spreadsheets, ideas, marketing plans, things Richard would have scoffed at. I listened with growing admiration, watching as my grandson quietly constructed something meaningful. I believed in him, the way Robert once believed in me. Then came my 66th birthday. Michael insisted on a gathering, a modest one at my home. At first, I hesitated. A lifetime of being surrounded by people who saw my kindness as a resource rather than a gift had left me cautious. But something in Michael's voice reminded me of my younger self, the version who used to host dinners just to make people feel welcome. It's time they remember whose house this is, he said with a determined smile. I spent the morning tending to the roses, pruning them back to life. My hands moved with purpose, restoring order where things had been left wild. Inside, the dining room table gleamed beneath freshly ironed linens. The air smelled of roasted garlic and lemon, my signature chicken dish, when the doorbell rang. At precisely 5, I felt ready. Richard and Pamela stood on the porch, their faces carefully composed. "Happy birthday, Mom," Richard said, thrusting forward a bouquet that still wore its grocery store plastic wrap. "Alice," Pamela added, giving me that smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You look different." Her gaze traveled from my bold red dress to my styled hair and the small earrings I had painted myself. "Thank you," I said. "It's good to feel like myself again." One by one, guests arrived. Jennifer and Mark with a bottle of wine, Martin Reynolds with his usual calm presence, and a few of Robert's oldest friends, who greeted me with warmth and sincerity. Dinner was lively, despite the undercurrent of tension that buzzed beneath every compliment Pamela offered. I saw Richard scanning the room repeatedly, his eyes lingering on the antique armoire, the hand-woven rugs, the paintings now adorning the walls. "Did you redecorate?" he asked during a lull in the conversation. "Some small changes," I replied. "I've started painting again." "Grandma's really talented," Michael chimed in, beaming. "She's already sold 2 pieces at the community art fair." Pamela blinked. "Sold? But, why?" I tilted my head. "Why not? It brings me joy." There it was again, that confusion, that inability to understand any activity not centered on profit or appearances. Then Michael mentioned the bookstore. "It's really happening," he said. "Thanks to Grandma's help, I've secured the initial funding and I'm reviewing lease options downtown." Richard's fork clattered onto his plate. "She's investing," he said, eyes fixed on me. "With what money?" I held his stare. "With mine." His mouth opened, then closed. "Perhaps we can discuss this privately," he muttered. "There's nothing private about supporting someone's dream," I said. Jennifer jumped in quickly with a story about their honeymoon, how lovely Cape Cod had been, how peaceful the walks on the beach were. She glanced at me with a smile full of gratitude. "It was perfect." "Thank you, Grandma." I nodded, glad she had embraced simplicity without resentment, but the reprieve didn't last. After dinner, as I cleared dessert plates in the kitchen, Pamela appeared, all softness and edge. "Alice," she said in a tone that dripped condescension, "what's going on with you?" I raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" First, the honeymoon thing. Then, months of silence. Now, you're throwing money at Michael's bookstore fantasy? I set down the serving spoon. "It's not a fantasy. It's a well-structured business plan. I believe in it." She scoffed. "Bookstores don't make money. He's using you." I stepped closer. "No, Pamela. He respects me. There's a difference." Her lips tightened. "Richard and I have been talking. We think it's time you moved somewhere more manageable. Sunrise Acres has lovely apartments. Selling this place would benefit all of us." There it was, laid bare. The real motive, no longer cloaked in brunches or favors. "This house isn't for sale," I said evenly. "And my living situation is not a group decision." Just then, Richard appeared. "Everything all right?" "Just wonderful," I said with a smile that didn't waver. I carried the cake back to the dining room. But before I could cut the first slice, Richard stood and cleared his throat. "Before we begin dessert, Pamela and I have something to share." I froze, the knife in my hand hovering over the icing. "We've noticed some concerning behavior lately," he said to the room. "Isolated decision-making, impulsive financial choices, and withdrawal from the family. We think it's time to consider a power of attorney arrangement, for Mom's protection." The table fell silent. Martin placed his cup down deliberately. "That's a serious legal step," he said calmly. "Do you have evidence of diminished capacity? She's giving away money, ignoring advice, refusing logical housing changes. What more do you need?" Richard said, arms outstretched. I remained still, then finally set the knife down. "I am not incapable. I am not reckless. I am not a burden to be managed." Richard's voice sharpened. "You're not thinking clearly." "No, Richard," I said. "I am thinking for the first time in years." As Richard's words echoed through the room, I felt a silence spread that no one dared disturb. It wasn't the quiet of politeness or hesitation, it was the hush that comes when a mask finally slips. He had said it out loud. In front of friends, family, even Martin. My own son had stood in my home and suggested I was unfit to manage my life, because I'd stopped allowing him to spend my money. I stared at him, my hands calm, my expression unreadable. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The woman who had once bent herself into 1,000 shapes to keep peace, was gone. In her place sat someone who had learned how dangerous it was to remain silent. I leaned back, folding my hands on the tablecloth. Power of attorney, I said slowly. That's quite the birthday surprise, Richard. Pamela jumped in, her voice oily with false concern. Alice, we're just trying to help. We've been worried. All these strange decisions lately, giving away money, investing in doomed businesses. You mean Michael's bookstore? I interrupted. The one he's building from the ground up with a full plan, a clear vision, and more integrity than you've displayed in years. The tension doubled. Jennifer looked away. Mark sipped water with trembling hands. But Michael, bless him, didn't flinch. He stood at the far end of the table, jaw tight, spine straight. Martin finally spoke. Alice appears entirely competent to me. And I've been observing her decisions for months. In fact, if we're going to discuss legality, he said, reaching into his leather briefcase with unhurried precision, then it might be time to revisit Robert's final wishes. Richard's face paled. Pamela blinked. Martin drew out the envelope. I knew it well. The same one he had handed me at Jennifer's wedding. Shortly before Robert's passing, Martin began, he added a codicil to his will. He asked me not to disclose it unless absolutely necessary. Given today's events, I believe we've reached that point. Codicil? Pamela asked. Her voice shrill. Martin nodded. Yes. It outlines specific protections for Alice. It states that any descendant who publicly humiliates her, attempts to coerce her into financial decisions, or tries to undermine her autonomy forfeits their share of the estate. A dead silence fell. You could hear the wind brushing against the window panes. That's absurd, Richard muttered. Dad wouldn't. He did, Martin said, cutting him off. I drafted it myself. He was clear and adamant. This is a setup, Richard snapped. She planned this. She let us believe. I let you assume, I said, my voice cold. Because I wanted to believe that love might still live somewhere under all that entitlement. But you proved me wrong. Pamela's face had gone from pink to ash. So what does this mean, legally, she asked, though I could tell she already knew. Martin answered, it means Richard and Pamela are disinherited. Their entire portion of Robert's estate is dissolved and redistributed. Redistributed to who? Richard demanded. To those who have treated Alice with respect and care, Martin said. All eyes turned to Michael. He shook his head, stunned. I didn't do any of this for money. I didn't even know there was a clause. We know, I said softly. And that's why your grandfather wanted you protected. Jennifer, quiet until now, finally spoke. Does that include me? Martin looked at his notes. You were present at multiple incidents, but there's no evidence you actively participated in the mistreatment. However, your silence does carry. Wait. Her voice cracked. I should have said something. About the name tag. About the brunch. I didn't realize how cruel it all was until I saw how hurt you looked. I reached across the table and took her hand. Acknowledging harm is a beginning. What you do after that is what matters. She nodded, eyes wet. Richard had gone rigid, his expression frozen somewhere between rage and disbelief. You're cutting us off? After everything we've done. For you? What you've done, I said, standing now, is take. You've demanded, manipulated, and pushed until there was nothing left to give but silence. So yes, I'm choosing to end that cycle. Pamela stepped forward, desperation overtaking pride. But the house, the stocks, this isn't fair. Martin adjusted his glasses. It's legal. And Robert made sure of it. Richard stood. Abruptly, his chair scraping hard against the wood floor. You think this is over? We'll fight it. You're welcome to try, Martin replied. But you'll lose. She tricked us. Richard yelled, gesturing to me. She set us up. No, I said. I let you reveal yourselves. The room stayed quiet as they gathered their things with clumsy haste. Jennifer and Mark offered hollow goodbyes. Richard didn't look at me. Pamela muttered something under her breath and left without another word. The door closed behind them. It was over. Not the fight, not the grief, but the pretending. I turned to Martin. Thank you. He nodded. He loved you deeply, Alice. This was his final act of protection. Michael moved to my side. You okay? Better than I've been in years, I said. And I meant it. I didn't need applause or congratulations. I needed space, distance, peace. And now, finally, I had all three. The silence that filled the house after Richard and Pamela left wasn't empty, it was healing. Like the hush that follows a storm, when the air smells different and the light feels sharper. I stood alone in my kitchen, listening to the echo of my own breath, my fingers still resting on the back of the dining chair. The confrontation had ended, but what lingered was a strange kind of freedom, an invisible weight that had lifted off my chest after years of wearing it like a second skin. For the first time in decades, I had spoken without apologizing. Defended myself without shrinking. And there had been no collapse, no fallout, only truth. Michael helped me clean up the plates, moving quietly, respectfully. He didn't try to fill the air with words. He simply stood beside me, rinsing glasses, stacking dishes, offering the kind of support that didn't require a spotlight. "I'm proud of you," he said eventually, glancing over as I wiped the last of the icing from the table. "You didn't flinch. You stood there and just took back everything they tried to take from you." I met his gaze, grateful beyond measure. "I wasn't always like this," I admitted. "I used to believe that peace was found in sacrifice. That love meant tolerating whatever people gave even when it was disrespect." He tilted his head. "What changed?" "Robert left me armor," I whispered. "But I had to decide to wear it." That night, after the last guest had gone and the house was still, I walked through each room with new eyes. The living room where I used to fold laundry while watching old westerns with Robert. The hallway where Jennifer had taken her first steps. The kitchen where Richard once begged for second helpings of my lasagna. Every corner was filled with memories, some painful now, some sacred. I wasn't ready to leave this place. Not for a condo, not for a retirement home, not for anyone else's convenience. This house wasn't just square footage. It was my sanctuary.in. The days that followed, I began redrawing the borders of my life, not in ink or signatures, but in behavior. Pamela called twice and left voicemails full of honeyed regret. I didn't return them. Richard emailed once, forwarding a link to an article about adult children managing elderly parents. I deleted it without opening. Jennifer, however, stopped by unannounced one afternoon with a small bouquet of daisies and an even smaller baby bump. "I wanted to tell you in person," she said, eyes wide with nervous excitement. "I'm pregnant." I took her hands in mine, heart blooming in my chest. "Then let's start fresh," I said. "But this time, we'll do it on honesty, not expectation." She nodded, tearfully. "That's all I want." Michael and I kept meeting weekly. The bookstore idea was gaining momentum. He showed me photos of potential spaces downtown, sunny storefronts with vintage brick and wide windows. "I'm calling it Chapter 1, he told me over tea. "Because that's what this feels like." And he was right. For both of us. I provided seed funding, but more than that, I offered encouragement. Guidance. Not as a financier, but as a grandmother who believed in his dream. A few weeks later, Martin invited me back to his office to finalize the new terms of my will. This time, the beneficiaries would reflect more than bloodlines. They would reflect behavior. Choices. Loyalty. "Are you sure?" he asked gently as I signed the last page. "This will change everything." "It already has," I replied. I returned home and placed the signed documents in my safe. It was the first time I had ever locked it without fear, because now, I wasn't locking something away. I was preserving it. For the right reasons. For the right people. That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the sky shift to lavender and gold. The garden had started blooming again, roses, tulips, even the stubborn daisies I'd nearly given up on. I thought about Robert. About the strength he saw in me long before I saw it myself. He didn't leave me with demands or warnings. He left me with protection, and the quiet confidence that I would know when to use it, and I had. Not with shouting. Not with revenge. But with boundaries. With silence that said, "No more." With choices that said, "I'm still here." And now, I choose me. 6 months later, the house felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. The rooms were still painted in the same soft creams and warm browns Robert had preferred, but the atmosphere was new, lighter somehow. The heaviness that used to cling to the walls had vanished, replaced by a quiet kind of joy. My schedule had transformed too. Mondays were for painting. Tuesdays for yoga. Thursdays, I joined a small circle of retired women at the community center for book club, where discussions often veered off into laughter and warm confessions. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was discovering. Michael visited often, notebook always in hand, sleeves rolled up, cheeks flushed from effort. His dream was no longer hypothetical. The bookstore, Chapter 1, had taken shape inside a charming Victorian building nestled on a sun-dappled street downtown. The renovations were modest but thoughtful, wooden shelves handcrafted by a local carpenter, mismatched reading chairs that invited lingering, and a coffee bar run by his girlfriend Emma, whose baked goods could have charmed the bitterest critic. I contributed quietly, enough to give the place wings, never enough to control its flight. On opening day, I stood in the entryway, heart swelling as customers filtered in, eyes widening in wonder. Children raced toward the storytelling nook. In the back, where a hand-painted mural covered the wall, a scene I'd created over 3 weekends, filled with hidden creatures and enchanted woods. In that space, magic didn't just feel possible, it felt inevitable. That afternoon, Jennifer appeared at the door, pushing a stroller. Her face was flushed from the early autumn breeze, and the baby blinked sleepily up at the world with eyes that mirrored her mother's. "I wanted you to meet someone," she said, lifting the small bundle gently into my arms. "This is Roberta." The name stole my breath. "After Grandpa," she added quietly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. The tiny fingers curled around mine, soft and impossibly small. "Hello, little one," I whispered. "Welcome." Jennifer and I had begun rebuilding our connection, slowly and sincerely. She had apologized more than once, not just for the name tag or the brunch, but for the years of letting silence stand in for loyalty. Her calls were more frequent now, her visits unannounced but never unwelcome. Mark, too, had made quiet efforts, repairing more with kindness than with words. Their path was still unsteady, but it led in the right direction. Richard and Pamela were no longer part of my life. After failing to contest the codicil in court, a process that had embarrassed them more than it had injured me, they moved to Florida. Richard took a job with one of his father's former acquaintances, and Pamela settled into a lifestyle she couldn't quite afford. I heard from them only through Jennifer's updates and the occasional Christmas card with hollow greetings. And that was enough. At the bookstore, the hum of conversation mingled with the scent of fresh coffee and paperbacks. I stood behind the counter with Emma, arranging new bookmarks I'd painted, small landscapes, floral designs, one shaped like a cat napping in a teacup. "These are going to sell out," she said. I smiled. "They're not for profit. Just for fun." She winked. "That's what people say before their hobby turns into a side hustle." Later that evening, Michael sat with me in the back reading room, the same place where I would soon host story time twice a week. "I've been thinking about expanding," he said. "More community programming, literacy tutoring, poetry nights, maybe even a writing workshop for high school students." His eyes sparkled as he spoke, full of energy and conviction. "But I'd have to reinvest some of the profits. Maybe delay phase 2 of the renovation." I reached for his hand. "Do it. Invest in your dream. Build something that matters. Money comes and goes. But this," I gestured to the walls around us, "this changes lives." As we sat in the soft glow of the overhead lights, I realized that this little store, born from hope and second chances, had become a sanctuary, not just for Michael, but for me. It was proof that legacy wasn't built from property or portfolios. It was shaped by the people we love, the things we nurture, the kindness we choose again and again. Robert would have been proud, not just of the bookstore, or the mural, or Michael's ambition, but of the quiet strength I had finally embraced. The strength to draw lines. To walk away. To start again. As I locked up for the night and stepped into the cool air, I looked up at the sign above the door, Chapter 1. Fitting, I thought. Because this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. 1 year after everything unraveled. I stood in my garden beneath a morning sky brushed with rose-gold clouds, clippers in one hand, a canvas tote filled with blossoms in the other. My roses had come back stronger than ever, vibrant, full of color, unapologetically in bloom. As I clipped a white bloom heavy with dew, I realized something simple but profound. I had never known what it meant to live for myself until the very people I had loved the most pushed me to the edge of disappearing. And instead of vanishing, I had become someone new. My days followed a rhythm that felt nothing like survival and everything like restoration. Mornings in the garden. Afternoons at the bookstore. Evenings spent painting, reading, or laughing with friends who saw me as more than what I could give. I hosted dinners, not grand affairs, just bowls of soup and warm bread for people who genuinely cared about the conversation, not the inheritance. Sometimes I sat with Claude, the kind widower I'd met on a group tour to Italy, our legs touching under the cafe table as we debated whether espresso should ever be sweetened. He called every Sunday, rain or shine, from Boston. And when he sent postcards with paintings of the Tuscan hills, he signed them, "To the strongest woman I've never had to save." Jennifer continued her visits, often with Roberta in tow. The baby had Robert's eyes, startlingly so. The first time she giggled at one of my painted bookmarks, I felt something settle deep inside me, an old ache replaced by a new kind of hope. Jennifer's growth had been slow but sincere. She asked questions now. She listened. She helped plant tulips in the front bed last week, hands dirty, laughter unguarded. "I still feel guilty," she admitted once, "for not saying anything when it mattered." Guilt, I told her gently, is a sign you're paying attention now. Keep paying attention. That's how we change. Mark helped at the bookstore when he could, repairing shelves, carrying heavy deliveries, always polite, always understated. I knew they were trying. Not for the inheritance that no longer existed in their direction, but because they finally saw me, not just what I could provide. Richard and Pamela faded into the background of my life. There were no dramatic reappearances, no apologies carved into letters or left on voicemails. Just silence. Jennifer said they had settled into a condo that wasn't quite what Mom wanted, and that Richard's job paid less than he expected. Occasionally, a Christmas card would arrive, one of those mass-printed ones with a staged photo and a vague, impersonal note. I never responded. Not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to say. My silence wasn't a punishment. It was protection. Michael's bookstore thrived. The community rallied behind it, teachers bringing their classes in for reading hours, local authors offering to host workshops, neighbors volunteering for literacy drives. "You built something sacred," I told him once as we stocked shelves. "With new titles?" "No," he replied, placing a book in my hands. "We did." He had hung one of my paintings above the children's section, a whimsical forest, dotted with treehouses and hidden creatures. A plaque below it read, "For the woman who reminded me stories aren't just in books, they're in blood." I never told him I cried the first time I read that Emma, now officially Michael's fiancée, baked the most extraordinary lemon scones. She had a head for business and a heart built for warmth. Sometimes, I caught her looking at me like I was more than Michael's grandmother, as if I were a woman she could learn from. She asked about my marriage, my art, my decisions. She asked to join me in my painting class once. I said yes. One afternoon, while sipping tea under the pergola Robert built decades ago, I received a letter, not from Richard, but from a lawyer in Florida. Enclosed was a request. Richard and Pamela wanted to know if I would consider attending a family mediation to revisit unresolved matters concerning legacy and forgiveness. I read the letter 3 times. There was no mention of an apology. No admission. Just a request for a seat back at a table they had once flipped over. I placed the letter in the fireplace without hesitation. The flames licked the paper with the same finality that I had once feared would feel cruel, but now felt necessary. I wasn't cruel. I was free. That evening, I painted until midnight, vivid orange skies, cliffs over wild seas, a single bird flying in the opposite direction. When I finished, I stood back and stared at the canvas. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was mine. The first time I stepped into the bookstore after hours, long after the lights had been dimmed and the last latte rinsed from the sink, I felt something sacred humming in the quiet. The wooden shelves, now worn just slightly from hundreds of fingertips, stood like sentinels, protecting the stories that filled them. There was magic in the air, not the kind spun from fairy tales or fantasies, but the sort born from rebuilding your life with your bare hands. I wandered toward the mural I'd painted, now smudged slightly from little palms pressing against their favorite animals hidden in the trees. It wasn't pristine anymore, but it was alive. It breathed. It had purpose. And so did I. In those still moments, I often thought about Robert. Not just as the husband who left me with financial security, but as the man who understood me so intimately that he crafted a legal safeguard against my own forgiveness. His codicil hadn't been about vengeance. It was his last embrace, one that could still be felt years after his voice had faded from the walls of our home. I used to ask myself whether we'd failed as parents, whether the entitlement I'd witnessed in Richard and Pamela was something we'd unknowingly nourished. But I no longer carried that guilt. I had shown them generosity, trust, unwavering presence. They had weaponized it. That was on them. Jennifer brought Roberta to the store every Friday now. The stroller wheels squeaked across the hardwood, and the bell over the front door always jingled with a little more cheer when they arrived. Roberta had learned to clap. Every time someone finished a book at story hour, she'd giggle and clap wildly, as if the author had just performed on stage. It made every parent in the room smile. Jennifer had changed too. Not instantly, not dramatically, but she'd grown into someone who apologized without conditions and asked for nothing in return. She attended parenting classes at the community center, volunteered for the bookstore's reading program. Once, I caught her quietly slipping money into the donation jar for our literacy initiative. When she noticed me watching, she just shrugged. "We all have to give something back," she said. It wasn't a declaration. It was a belief. And I knew then she'd turned a corner. One sunny morning, she and I sat on the back patio behind the bookstore, watching Roberta nap in her stroller while sipping coffee Emma had brewed to perfection. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked gently, not looking up. I didn't have to ask who she meant. "Not in the way you think," I replied. "I miss the people I thought they were. The fantasy I convinced myself was real. But what I don't miss," I said, setting my cup down, "is the version of myself I had to become to keep that illusion alive." Jennifer nodded, eyes fixed on the stroller. "Sometimes I wonder if I'll become them." I reached over and covered her hand with mine. "You won't. Because you're already wondering. That's how it starts, by choosing awareness over comfort." Michael arrived minutes later, smiling as always, carrying boxes of new arrivals for the store. Big week, he announced. The first community writing workshop starts tomorrow. We had to close registration, it sold out in 3 days. I couldn't hide my pride. His success was no accident. He had earned every inch of it. That afternoon, I painted a new bookmark design, an open hand holding a blooming tree. On the back, I wrote a quote: "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you build while you're here." Later that week, a package arrived at my home with no return address. Inside was a photo album. Handbound, its cover embossed with gold script, family, as it was. Inside were photos, some I'd seen before, others I hadn't. Richard as a child, holding a wooden plane Robert carved. Pamela and Jennifer at the beach, mid-laugh. Michael, as a toddler, smeared with paint at the kitchen table. There were sticky notes inside, written in Jennifer's handwriting. "I'm trying to remember everything. The good parts too." I closed the album and pressed it to my chest. Healing didn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it meant simply honoring what once was, even as you moved far beyond it. That evening, I wrote my own note and placed it in a sealed envelope marked with Jennifer's name. "You have a chance to do better, not just for Roberta, but for yourself. Keep choosing the harder path, the one where you question, where you stay kind, where you apologize when it's hard. That's how we undo what came before. That's how we build something new." The next day, I placed the envelope on her seat at the bookstore before she arrived. She never said anything about it. But the way she hugged me the next time we met said she'd read every word. A year and a half after that name tag attempted to reduce my existence to a balance sheet, I found myself in a place I never expected: contentment. Not the flashy kind people chase with yachts or gated communities, but the quiet sort that grows slowly when you stop shrinking to make others comfortable. My life was full, not of obligations or expectations, but of color, laughter, and people who saw me as a person, not a transaction. And yet, despite the peace I'd built, reminders of the past still found their way in. One crisp October morning, as golden leaves danced across my front porch, I received a letter from a former neighbor in Florida. She'd run into Pamela at a consignment shop and shared that Richard had been laid off again. The two of them had downsized to a modest apartment. She looked tired, the letter read, but mostly angry. I folded the note and slid it into a drawer, not out of malice, but because it belonged with the other remnants of a chapter one had closed. They had gambled their legacy against my silence, and lost. I didn't rejoice in it. I just refused to reopen the door they'd slammed shut. Michael's bookstore was thriving. Chapter 1 had become more than a place to buy novels, it was a community hub. High school students stayed late for writing workshops. Parents dropped in after school pickups. Seniors met there for poetry nights and chess matches. I hosted a monthly watercolor class in the back room, where I taught with paint-streaked hands and a laugh I hadn't heard in years, my own. Emma, now officially part of the family, had expanded the cafe menu and started a monthly open mic night. One evening, Michael took the stage to read an essay titled, "The Woman Who Taught Me to Say No." When he finished, he looked directly at me. I didn't clap. I stood up and wrapped him in an embrace. My tears fell on his collar. "You saved me," he whispered. "You brought yourself back," I corrected. Jennifer began visiting more frequently. Sometimes with Roberta, now toddling on chubby legs, other times alone. We didn't talk about Richard and Pamela much. Not because the wounds weren't real, but because we'd learned that healing often requires focusing on who shows up, not who doesn't. She shared her dreams of going back to school. I offered to help. She refused. At first, pride thick in her throat, but eventually accepted, not as a handout, but as an investment in a future she was finally ready to build. "You're not my bank," she said one afternoon, holding her coffee like a shield. "You're my beginning." And just like that, the girl who had once laughed at a cruel joke handed me something far more valuable than any apology: awareness. Sometimes, people from my past reached out. Distant cousins. Former friends. Even a pastor who once preached at Robert's memorial. They'd heard things, bits and pieces. They wanted to reconnect. I kept those interactions polite but brief. Not out of spite, but self-preservation. The older I grew, the more sacred I found my energy. I no longer offered it like candy at a party. It had to be earned. One Sunday afternoon, Claude visited from Boston. We sat on the porch, wrapped in wool blankets, watching the light shift across the sky. "You're glowing," he said, sipping his tea. "This place suits you." I smiled. I fought hard to keep it. "Not just the house," he replied. "You." And in his words, I heard something I hadn't in decades: being seen without expectation. He stayed for dinner: simple roasted vegetables, crusty bread, a bottle of wine we didn't finish. When he kissed my hand goodbye at the door, I didn't feel the need to explain, define, or label anything. Some connections simply are. That night, as I looked around the home I'd reclaimed, walls painted with my art, vases filled with blooms. From my garden, a dining table now surrounded by those who respected its host, I felt the full weight of what had been lost. And what had been gained in its place. I hadn't just endured a betrayal. I had used it as a blueprint for reinvention. I didn't burn bridges. I let them rot when the builders stopped showing up. As I climbed into bed, quilt pulled up to my chin, the moon casting pale silver patterns on the floor, I whispered into the stillness, "You were right, Robert. They showed me who they were." And I finally listened. The second anniversary of Jennifer's wedding arrived without ceremony. There were no grand family reunions, no catered brunches, no printed name tags. Just a quiet phone call from Jennifer in the early morning, her voice soft as she asked, "Can we come over for dinner tonight?" I said yes. Not out of habit, not out of duty, but because I wanted to. And that simple shift, choosing love without condition, was the clearest evidence I had that I'd reclaimed my life. When the doorbell rang that evening, it wasn't a parade of people demanding space in my home. It was just Jennifer, Mark, and little Roberta in her rainbow sweater, holding a wrinkled paper flower she had made in preschool. "It's for you, Gigi," she beamed, thrusting it into my hands. I bent down to kiss her cheek, the weight of her gesture more valuable than any check I'd ever written. We ate spaghetti and garlic bread in the kitchen. Mark cleared the table. Without being asked. Jennifer refilled our glasses. Roberta sang a nonsense song that made all three of us laugh until tears ran down our faces. After dinner, Jennifer and I sat on the porch while Mark played peekaboo with their daughter in the yard. "I haven't spoken to them in months," she said, her eyes watching the silhouettes of her husband and child under the fading sky. "I think they're still angry. At you. At me. At the world." I nodded. "Some people are more loyal to their resentment than to the people who love them." "I don't want to become that," she said. "Then don't," I replied. "Every day you have the chance to be different. Better. It's never too late to grow in a new direction." She rested her head on my shoulder. "I used to think money was the answer to everything. Now I realize the real currency is time. Patience. Truth. It took me a long time to learn that, too," I said. The wind shifted. Leaves rustled across the lawn. Roberta shrieked with delight as Mark lifted her into the air and spun her in a circle. The sound of their laughter filled the dusk. "She'll grow up with stories," Jennifer whispered. "About you. About how you chose boundaries over approval. Dignity over silence. I want her to know that strength looks like this." I didn't speak. I just held her hand. That night, after they left, I walked through my home one final time. With the eyes of someone who had survived the erosion of love and rebuilt her foundation. Every photograph that hung on the walls had been rearranged. Not erased, just recontextualized. I didn't remove the images of Richard or Pamela. I didn't need to. They no longer had power here. Instead, I added new ones. Roberta in my lap holding a picture book. Michael beaming at the ribbon cutting of Chapter 1. Claude and I, wine glasses in hand, standing beside one of my paintings at a local gallery. Life had gone on, but not passively. I had directed it like a symphony. A few days later, I received an envelope from Martin Reynolds. Inside was the final draft of my updated estate plan. I reviewed the names: Michael, Jennifer, Roberta, Emma. People who had shown me that respect was not earned through obligation but through character. I added one final note, handwritten, to be included in the file. To my family, the true legacy isn't what you inherit, it's how you honor what came before you. I gave generously, but what I truly offered was love. To those who returned it, I leave what I can. To those who didn't, I leave the chance to grow anyway. That's the most valuable gift I have left to give. Alyssa. As I signed the bottom, I felt no vengeance. No lingering bitterness. Just clarity. Robert had tried to shield me with paper and law. But in the end, it wasn't the codicil that protected me. It was my choice to stop giving pieces of myself to people who only knew how to take. It was my voice, once buried under guilt and politeness, now restored. It was my refusal to keep the peace by surrendering it. Now, when people ask me what it felt like to lose everything I thought I had, I tell them this: I didn't lose. I found strength in the unraveling. I found truth in the silence. And I found myself, not in the inheritance I withheld, but in the legacy I finally claimed, and that was priceless.